Hello, welcome to this vodcast looking at the Berlin crisis of 1961. This is the first of three crises you have to examine as part of your GCSE History on superpower relations. First off, we're going to have a look at a bit of a recap on Berlin. So, at the end of World War II, Germany had been divided east and west, Soviet Union controlling the eastern half of Germany, and the British, the French and the Americans controlling the west. If you remember, Berlin was in East Germany, or the eastern side of Germany should I say, and the Soviets again controlled the East Berlin, and the West Berlin was again controlled by the French, the British and the Americans. Now, West Berlin had had a lot of money spent on it as part of the Marshall Plan, and therefore it became a beacon of the West's wealth and its higher standards of living. If you remember the Berlin blockade and the subsequent Berlin airlift, these were enacted because of Stalin's fear of a kind of united Germany with Western influence. So you can imagine that having a beacon of capitalism with American dollars being spent on it, just put an American dollar sign there, would draw lots of people to want to move there. Now, as stated, the Berlin blockade was a failure for the Soviet Union. By the end of 1949, Germany had been divided into West Germany and East Germany. The inner German border between East and West Germany had been sealed, but the border between East and West Berlin remained open. That meant that if you lived in East Germany, you could get to West Germany by getting into East Berlin and crossing over into the West. And West Berlin had this higher standard of living and freedom that people could see in East Germany. It was like a capitalist and democratic Western piece of propaganda in the middle of East Germany. And this led to a refugee problem. They estimate between 2.7 million to 3 million people left East Germany through Berlin. You see, East Germany had the opposite of West Germany, whereas West Germany had the Marshall Plan, it had economic prosperity and a higher quality of living. East Germany had the opposite. It lacked jobs, it had poor wages, it had very few consumer goods, it was forced collectivization, meaning a forced planned economy, and it had little political freedom. You had the Stasi secret police observing you in case you seemed to be anti-communist. So refugees took advantage of this crossing point between East and West Berlin, and as stated, between 1949 and 61, they reckon between 2.7 million to 3 million people escaped into the West through West Berlin. But it wasn't just the numbers, it was who was involved. If you have a look, skilled people, doctors, engineers, scientists, managers, people who were needed for East Germany to prosper were leaving, and that was creating what was known as a brain drain. Therefore, that led to reduced skill quality in the population. It also encouraged other people to defect, and in doing so, as a consequence of that, it weakened communist rule. All of this combined to make the refugee problem a propaganda disaster for the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, as it proved many people preferred the capitalist West to the communist East. And as a result, in 1958, Khrushchev declared the whole city of Berlin belonged to East Germany, and he issued an ultimatum that gave the American troops and the American government 6 months to leave. He wanted to force action on them. This is what is known as brinkmanship. Eisenhower, rather than creating further tension with the Soviet Union, called for talks on the issue, and the Soviet and the American leaders met several times. To begin with, their foreign ministers met in Geneva in Switzerland in May 1959, and nothing much was agreed other than to have more talks. After that, the two leaders, here you can see Eisenhower and here Nikita Khrushchev, they met at Camp David, which is the American presidential retreat, and that was in September 1959. And again, the outcome of it was to have more talks. They would begin to meet for a third time in Paris in May 1960. However, during this summit, an incident occurred. a U-2 spy plane that the Americans had spying over Soviet Russia was shot down. Now, the Americans initially tried to claim it was a weather plane that had gone off course, but that didn't last long because the pilot had been captured and he admitted to spying on the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev stormed out of the summit talks. So, the final summit was in 1961 in Vienna with a new player. In January 1961, John F. Kennedy replaced Eisenhower as President of the United States. Now, Khrushchev believed he could bully Kennedy into giving up Berlin, especially after an incident called the Bay of Pigs, in which Kennedy had to be seen to back down, or at least he lost some face. Khrushchev therefore renewed his Berlin ultimatum that he'd given to Eisenhower. Kennedy, however, refused to appear weak, so there was no decision made on Berlin. But Kennedy did increase defense spending, adding an extra $2 billion to American spending on its military. Now, this sets us up for why the Berlin Wall, sets us up to understand why the Berlin Wall was built. As you can see, you've got key issues. The refugee crisis, which leads on to the brain drain, which leads on to the summits, which leads on to Kennedy increasing military spending. The next PowerPoint, or the next vodcast, will actually have a look at how the wall was built and the outcomes from that for the consequences, which is a key part of your understanding. I hope this has been useful, and thank you for listening.